Yes. Yes. Okay. Good. All right. Well, good afternoon, ladies. Nice to see you again after, um, since January, right? Since January. It was winter and now it's supposedly spring. It's winter. Okay, it's not warm, but it's spring. There's no snow, there's no ice, right? So the, up north. Okay, but not here in Cote-Saint-Luc, so that's what we have to be grateful for. Right. All right. So nice to see you again, and I hope you had a good, healthy 3 months since we've seen each other. So this book is Buckeye. Has anybody read it? Yeah. Oh, it's hard. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, because that makes not so. So wait, tell me again, how many late of you? One, two, three, only four. Okay. So the trouble is, oh, decided to, oh, sorry. Hold on. You know what? Yeah, yeah. It's okay. It can get through. This is like, I could move back a little more. Um, so that's the problem, but is how to do this. Do I do this? There'll be some spoiler alerts. I just have to say it. It's fine. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because it's very hard to talk about a book with no spoiler alerts. You could write a little review, but if we're going to speak about it or if I'm going to talk about it at any kind of length, it's hard not to. So, although, it doesn't really matter because this book is not as the author himself says, is not a plot-driven novel. It's really a novel about characters. It's about place and it's about characters. So, um, yeah, so there'll be spoilers, but if those of you who haven't read it will get it, and those of you who are on a waiting list, hopefully you'll get it. I don't think it's going to detract from your reading of the book. I never heard. I wasn't familiar with Patrick Ryan, the author of this book. This is his first adult novel. He's I guess in the literary world, well enough known. He's known for short stories. So he's been a short story writer for many years, as well as an editor. He's also published three young adult novels, and this is his first, as he said in one interview, grown up novel. Um, Interesting that it was short stories that he was known for because that really, those of you who read the book, you can almost see, and an interviewer said to him, I could almost see you with your background, your strong background in short story writing, having written this as four separate short stories almost, or at least stories about the four different main characters. So that's like was interesting. Otherwise, it's close to 450 pages, which is no short story. So to go from the short story format to a novel, which I guess the adjective epic comes in when you talk about a 450-page book. Although I know there are 900-page books and 800-page books. Generally, I stay away from them because I guess I don't know. Long books like that make me a little nervous that I'm not going to finish them. So I generally don't. And that you could definitely say, that's a long book. 450 pages is a long enough book, but not necessarily, not something that you say, oh, but for him, this is very long. And he said, for him, and he, especially, coming as being a short story writer or a young adult novel writer, because generally young adult novels wouldn't be longer than a couple of hundred pages. And also, not just that reason, but just the reason that if you work in such a different format, then to write something like this, like how does an author go from writing short stories, which I think, and I'm not a writer, but I think most of us at some point in school had to write a short story as part of I don't know what grade English class, and it's not easy. It's harder, I think, to write a good short story than a novel, because a novel, you don't have a page limit. You could write as much or as little as you choose to. Short novels are called novellas. And like, what's the difference between a novella and a short story? I don't know what the page limit, actual definition is, but short stories, to have a good short story is definitely a very difficult skill. And that's why good short story writers, in my mind, are really brilliant. And when you read good ones, and we've done collections of short stories over the years. Who comes into mind? The now, let's say, name besmirched late Alice Munro, who was a wonderful, wonderful writer. I know, after the scandal that her husband abused whatever that's her daughter. So then Alice Munro became persona non grata and her books were taken off the shelves. But she never, personal life aside, and if you can do that, was a brilliant writer. And good short story writers are wonderful. So what made him do this? He said that he had the idea for this book, and he had these characters that he wanted to develop. And he decided that he was going to write a novel. But as I said, he never planned on writing such a long novel. And then it just kind of grew and grew, and what he wanted to say expanded. And he ended up with this book that he said, I kind of can't believe that I wrote this book. It was longer than anything I've done. It took him 6 years to write it, many, many drafts. And interesting too, besides being a short story writer, he worked for many years as an editor. He was an editor at a magazine called Granta, which is a literary magazine, and he worked in other places as an editor as well. So one of the interviewers had asked him, because you were an editor, how does that affect your writing? Like, does it make a difference? Authors write and they rewrite and they tear up drafts of books and rework things over and over again. But they're doing that themselves as a writer, whether they're, because they're not satisfied. But they all have editors. So he too, even though he's an editor, worked as an editor for so many years, he had an editor for this book as well. So somebody else but he said, I self-edit all the time. I self-edit for every page I have. There are many pages that are in the garbage. I have a whole jar of red pens where I work, and you should see the number of red pen. Every page is the ones that survive not being thrown out are full of red marks. So editing, and he came up with this. To tell you a little bit about him, because I wasn't familiar with him. I mean, I guess I don't read so widely, but I'm curious now to read, and I haven't checked yet if the library probably has it, has collections of his early stories. He was born in 1965, just to give you an idea of how old he is. His first short story collection was published in 2006, 20 years ago. The name is Send Me. And then the next one, he wrote The Dream Life of Astronauts, which was a collection of short stories about the astronauts involved in the space program in Florida. And as well, he's written these novels for young adults. He was born in Washington, D.C., and raised in Florida. So this book about the astronauts and the space program comes from the fact that he lived and grew up in Florida. He did his undergraduate degree in Florida, and then he went to do a master's in fine arts at the writing program at Bowling Green State University. Where's Bowling Green State University? Sorry? In Ohio. Yes, of course. Yeah, right. I know. Yeah. What made you say Ohio? Oh, okay. Because I think Bowling Green. Anyway, yes, it's in Ohio, which contributed to his setting. This novel is set in a fictional town in Ohio. So he said because he spent 2 years there in graduate school, even though he grew up on the East Coast, Ohio was familiar to him. And he got this idea. Well, I think first, I'll tell you one of the germs of the idea for this book, but why he said it in Ohio. He also said that growing up on the East Coast and in Florida, and by the ocean, he was fascinated by landlocked areas of the country. There's a lake near this fictitious town, but generally Ohio's pretty landlocked, Midwest. So that's where the novel is set. And that's a bit about his background. He wrote short stories for 10 years prior to the publication of his first book. And the short stories earned him different awards and fellowships. He was included in the Best American Short Stories in 2006. And his first book, which was a young adult book, which was called Send Me, was a collection of linked stories that looks at 4 decades in the life of a dysfunctional family. So yes, it looked at 4 decades because this book spans 4 decades as well. But those were short stories. So, you could pick an episode here and you pick an episode there, and you could look at 4 different decades, and you don't have to have a 450-page book. But if you're going to write a novel and you want to span, and as he said, as he started to write this book, he didn't intend, as I said, for it to be so long. And he also didn't know how long a time period the story would cover. But then as he started to work on it, as he figured out his characters and what he wanted to say with the characters, because as he said, I am a character-driven author. Plot is okay, but I don't, every book needs some sort of plot, or, well, not every book, because some of these, different kinds of books don't have plots. But he said, but it's not my driving force. For me, character development, looking at people's lives is what's important. And plot, and if you think of it, people's lives, ordinary people's lives, just the living is the plot itself. Life is the plot. So you can do it like that. You don't need any other, if you're a good enough writer, and if you understand and observe human nature well enough, you can have stories out of that don't need a plot. So that's what he did over here. But dysfunctional families, which I guess if you're going to write about people, most people at some point, came from a family, lived in a family, although one of the characters in the book, the young woman Margaret, and the book really is 4 main characters, 2 men, 2 women who are married to each other, 2 couples. One of the women, Margaret, she is an orphan, and she was what's called a foundling. She was literally left in a basket at an orphanage in 1917 or so, when such things still existed, and she grew up without family. But family is usually the material of, or is much of the material of many short stories, and that's what he was writing about. And when he wrote for young adults, and interesting that he wrote for young adults first, because I didn't read the stories, but just from what I read about him, what did he write about in his young adult books? One of them, published in 2008, deals with 2 this is a young adult novel, 2 teenage friends, best friends, one who is gay and one who is not, struggling with family issues, drug abuse, divorce, dating, and a rupture in their friendship. So there's, that's a lot of stuff. That's a young adult novel. And that was, almost 20 years ago. Then he published his second young adult novel in 2009 about a young man's relationship with his con artist uncle, who attempts to lure him into a life of charity scams. This is the young adult stuff. And then his 2011 novel follows a boy and a girl who are fraternal twins and their competitions for the affection of a boy who comes to live with their family for a short period of time. Then he worked, as I said, so then he had this collection of short stories published in 2016, The Dream Life of Astronauts. He worked as an editor for this literary magazine, Granta, for many years. And he published his Buckeye is his first adult novel, which was published in 2025. And it follows the lives of these two couples set in the fictitious town of, and it's an interesting name that he gave it, Bonhomie, Bonhomie. So we would say Bonhomie, but I don't know how you would say it if you were American. Bonhomie? Bonhomie. Um, in Ohio, he sets it in Ohio from World War II to the end of, like, say, 40 years after that, into the 1980s. And the book looks at the secrets which develop between them over time. And I thought the name of this town, and I didn't find this anywhere in an interview, but Bonhomie, which sounds, I don't know, just sounds weird, but if you write it out and sort of bonhomie, it could be to me all kinds of things like good man, in a way, bon homme or bonhomie or bon ami or good friends. I don't know. He didn't mention it at all. So maybe I'm just, or bonhomie. I mean, what's that in French? How would you translate that? It's like um, good, right? Like good and it's good vibe, something like, yeah. So I thought, oh, that's an interesting name. And I mean, I should write, you can write authors now and say, why did you name the town that you're writing about this? But because he didn't touch on it. And I listened to a few interviews and read some interviews. Anyway, pardon? It doesn't it? Yes, it does. Oh, you haven't read the book. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No. So yeah. Um, so I found an interview with him. And in this interview, he was asked he was asked what would you say if you had to give me your elevator pitch for this book, which is like, describe your book in a few sentences to somebody who doesn't know anything about it. So since many of you haven't read the book, so this is what he answers. He says, here's the elevator pitch for a tall building with many floors, or with a few floors. But Buckeye is set in a small town in Ohio. So this is the author describing his book. It opens at the moment of the Allied victory in Europe during World War II. It's when the Allies have, declared that Germany has surrendered, not yet in the Pacific, but in Europe. Germany surrendered, and there's Victory Day in Europe. So it opens exactly at that moment. And it spans 40 years. And it's about two families whose lives become intertwined and compounded by one bad decision and one big mistake that will redefine both of them and the next generation. That's how he sums up his book. Buckeye reads like a significant chapter in the story of white, upwardly mobile American society from the 1920s to the this is the interviewer saying, to the 1970s, but I think it goes like into the 80s. And what triggered him writing this story? He says, my influences came in part from a lot of my early reading as a teenager. And from what he said in an interview, he read voraciously. He said, I read widely without much guidance, literary fiction and popular fiction and genre fiction and trashy novels. And when he was asked, were your parents readers, your siblings? It seems like he's the youngest of three. He said, they were, how did he word it very nicely? They read popular books, and that's what was around the house. And he said, so my parents weren't particularly, they didn't have a lot of money to spare, and it didn't sound like they went to the library either, because he said we would buy a book for the house, and if we would all be reading it at the same time, my parents and I, because he said by that time my siblings had left home, that we had our different bookmarks, and the rule in the house was if you weren't reading the book, leave it on the table in the living room, so anybody else, like I guess he was reading his parents, they could all be reading the same book at the same time. So he read everything from whatever was popular, the bestseller clubs of the 1970s, 1980s. He read that. And he said one summer when he was 16, he read all of the Lord of the Rings, all of Tolkien. He read C.S. Lewis, the Narnia series. He's like, because he was asking he was asked, what were your influences? But he said, I read like all the other bestseller stuff as well. I just read, which he said is very good, because if you only focus on literary fiction, then you get a certain, idea. But if you read everything, and he said, writers like Stephen King. He says Stephen King is a brilliant storyteller. You could classify him maybe as a popular writer, but he tells a very good story. So Patrick Ryan said he read everything. And he said, I was also influenced by, and remember, I don't know if you remember, we talked about Pat Barker. Pat Barker is a British writer. It's a she, by the way. One of these writers whose name on purpose, she's British, and it's Patricia, whereas he's Patrick, but her name on her books is Pat Barker. So you wouldn't know necessarily that whether it's a male or a female, but she wrote books about the First World War. She had a trilogy, the Regeneration trilogy, and then the Life Class trilogy, which was the Second World War. So he said that was very influential, those books on me. All of Elizabeth Strout's writing, and we've done, Elizabeth Strout is an author who I very much admire and whose books we've been doing over the year. He said, I think Elizabeth Strout is just brilliant. And Elizabeth Strout writes short stories as well as fiction, generally short fiction. Remember, she wrote Olive Kitteridge, and then a second Olive Kitteridge book. So that's Elizabeth Strout. So he very much enjoys Elizabeth Strout. Also, Anne Patchett is one of his good friends, he says. And if you've read this book, and if you've read Anne Patchett, whose books we have done, we did The Dutch House and we did Tom Lake most recently, it's a similar feel almost. Like if you read Tom Lake and if you read The Dutch House, you will find, yes, you're shaking, yeah, that isn't there like a similar feel to the writing style. So he and Anne Patchett. In fact, he says at one point when he was trying to figure out how to write scenes in the book set, because at one point, so these are two couples, and he follows their lives from the 1940s, from the Second World War until 40 years later. And at one point, one of the men of the two couples, Felix, he volunteers for the Navy, and he can't go as a regular soldier, but because he's colorblind, but he gets a job on a naval ship, on a cargo ship, and he's in the Pacific, and his boat, the boat that he's on, the ship that he's on, is torpedoed. And there's a scene that reads out of a Herman Wouk book, and it's like you can just picture it the way he's describing it, but he never went through anything like that. So when an interviewer said to her, how do you write a scene like that about a torpedoed boat in the Pacific? He said, I remembered what Anne Patchett said to me when I asked her advice. When I said to her, you wrote a book and you had a scene in Bel Canto where something happened that you never would have been you didn't live through it. And she said, my advice is, because there are, over the centuries, writers write about things that they haven't experienced. How do the good ones do it? Or at least Anne Patchett's advice was, write as if you have blinkers on your eyes. And so just focus on the character. You're the character. You're there living that experience. Don't try to get too big a scene, in any cinematic attempt, because that's harder to pull off. But you, just from your narrow focus, so there's the boat is torpedoed and the character Felix is in the water with the other sailors on his boat, who are trying, many of them die, but they're scrambling for life vests, and and the ship is leaking oil, and it's a scene of chaos, and floating, the contents of the ship are there, and these little lifeboats are floating there, but not everybody's in reach of them, and it's awful. And he does, at least I think, I never lived through that, but he does a very good job of it. And he said it was Anne Patchett, another one of the influences on his writing, who gave him that what he feels very good advice. Focus on your character and you'll be able to do it like that. And he says, finally, I'm forever inspired by what I think is one of the best books about the United States ever written, The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. He says, hugely moving books that don't feel like books so much as lives of people, which is what life is about. And he said, that's what I try to do. But the first spark for this novel, which I thought was really interesting, and those who read it, he says, was finding out that my paternal grandmother, the mother of my father, who was a pious and difficult person, had maintained an affair with someone in her small town in Ohio for decades. He he said, when I found that out, I thought, oh, he said, I didn't want to write about her. I had no interest in writing her story, but the situation of an affair that went on for many years, and it was my grandmother, and it was a small town in Ohio, it intrigued me because when I started to think about it, it was a small community. It was a huge deceit. And plus the time period when this affair of his grandmother took place, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and all the complications that might arise from that, he said, that triggered something. And I thought, oh, this could be the spark of a novel, of a story, if I ever do that. So he said, I started working on the novel in the summer of 2016. And I have a very, very slow process of writing. I write very slowly. I revise continuously. And that's where he says about all his red pens. And then he says, but to do it, when I realized that if I'm going to start in the 1940s, he said, I never had any intention of writing historical fiction, but I guess you could call this, at this point, historical fiction. So he said, so I had to do a lot of research. I read quite a few books about America during the First and Second World War. I read a lot of articles I found online, of course, and I spoke to people with knowledge about various aspects of the subject matter, including a man in his 90s who was a veteran. And so he says, but that I like that the little germ of an idea about the affair, and there's an affair that happens in this story as well. One of the women in the two couples, one woman and one man, have an affair. Very brief, definitely nothing like that of his grandmother. Only it only lasted very short period of time, but it had repercussions, and that's what the book is about: the repercussions of this affair, of this indiscretion, of this, as he says, bad decision, and then all the other. And it's a novel, so there's fallout. I'm not going to. Anyway, there's fallout, and the repercussions continue, and so that's what interested him. He said, "I chose the location because." Having grown up in Florida and having had grandparents from Ohio, I really was very intrigued by the Midwest. And also, he said, because I did my graduate degree there and I lived there for 2 years. So I had a flavor for the atmosphere, and I knew it suited the subject matter that I wanted to write about. He said, structurally, and it's an interesting structure. It opens, as he said, the last day, the day, Victory Day, when peace is declared, when the war is declared over in 1945, in May of 1945. But it then goes, it goes for the next 40 years. He said, my intention was to be chronological as possible. But once I had my basic story worked out, I knew that I couldn't tell it that way. And if you read the book, it goes back and forth. But not back and forth in an annoying way. It's just when you look at it, you realize, oh yeah, it is going back and forth, because it does start there in May 1945 and it goes for the next 40 years, but it starts with a particular incident in 1945, and then he fills in background. So he said, the idea was I always had the idea that my novel was going to open with two strangers meeting. And that meant, though, that I would need to back up and tell how each of them got there. So the book takes some risks, this is the author talking, in terms of structure. because it shows the reader an important moment in these characters' lives, what happens that day in May of 1945 when they first meet, and then it backs up and works its way toward that moment twice from two different angles. And then it proceeds to span 4 decades. So no wonder it took him all those years to write. When you think of it, it's not an easy feat. You know, as I always feel, we read the finished product, but all the work that goes on before. And he says, it's the characters that matter most to me. As a writer, I work very hard to make my characters convincing to myself, because I'm I'm my first and most critical reader, I think. So, because if they're not convincing characters to me, if they don't sound right, if they don't sound plausible, then how would they ever sound plausible to a reader? So that's very important. He said, once I get a solid grasp on the characters and I figured out their arcs and where they are each going to land eventually emotionally, then I feel a responsibility to see them through. Also to explore them thoroughly. And it doesn't end up, everything doesn't end up, making it to the page, but that's how I do it. So he says, so he's asked, so you have the 4 characters, Cal, Becky, Felix, and Margaret. They're your main characters. And you have the two sons. Each of the couples has 1 son, Skip and Tom. And then there are peripheral characters. One of the best characters is Everett, Cal's father, who is a World War I veteran. So the book looks at, among other things, besides relationships between people, the idea of deception, the idea of secrets, which was, once Patrick Ryan decided that he was going to write about or at least he was influenced by finding out that his grandmother had conducted an affair for decades, this pious and difficult grandmother of his in small town Ohio, and that was going to be part of his book, or it was the catalyst for how he was going to tell his story. But it also is very much, and that's where Pat Barker's war trilogy novels come into place, a look at war and the way wars and world wars influenced the men who fought them and the societies that they were part of. So in the book takes, as you say, it opens up at the end of the Second World War. But Cal, and I'll read you a little bit the opening page because it's just wonderful, his writing. His father, Cal's father, is a World War I veteran. And he has been what was called back in those days, before the term PTSD was coined after the Vietnam War, was called shell shock. So so Everett, this strange, crotchety, hoarding, at least by the time we meet him, old man Everett, who's sits on his typewriter and is typing out letters to whoever the current president of the United States is. He is a World War I veteran whose life has completely been, was changed by his experiences fighting in Europe in the First World War. And that's why Everett is very pleased when his son Cal is not able to be drafted in the Second World War, which I will read you in the opening pages. And then you have the effects of the Second World War are a big part of the book. And at the end, we get to the war in Vietnam, where the sons of these 2 couples are affected, and their families, of course, and the whole country, because that's what wars do, they affect whole countries, are affected by the war in Vietnam. So the book really gives you a big piece of American history while you're reading about these characters. Listen to how he opens. How he opens the book, and he starts by saying, Chapter 1. Cal Jenkins was born in the spring of 1920 with one leg shorter than the other, just 2 inches shorter, but that was enough to make plenty of things difficult. And then I went looking, like, 2 inches shorter. That's not insignificant. Like, he says but think of it. And that's what he wants to make you think about. 2 inches shorter. So in 1920, Balancing on a bicycle took twice as long for him to learn as it did for other kids. Track and field was out of the question. So was walking without a pronounced limp or going up and down a set of stairs without securing himself on the railing. Until his father, amateur carpenter and junk collector, improved Cal's condition by carving a new, thicker sole out of tire rubber and nailing it on to his left shoe. At school, boys made fun of the way Cal walked, then made fun of the shoe with the extra thick sole. Someone noticed within an hour of the first day he wore it. But one boy, flush-cheeked and small for his age, pulled Cal aside during morning assembly and told him he was unique in God's eyes. "I know," that boy said, "because I am too. I can't touch my toes, you see. I have unusually tight hamstrings." He bent over to demonstrate, and his fingertips barely reached his kneecaps. "We are each meant for a special thing," the boy said. And when Cal asked what his special thing was, the boy shrugged and said the two of them would have to wait to find out. So that's how we're introduced to Cal. Then we find out in the next paragraphs that they find out separately and years later after Japan, because remember, they're born in 1920, when after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and threw the country into a panic, after young men stopped waiting for their numbers to be drawn and began to volunteer, they found out that having one leg 2 inches shorter than the other was enough to make a person unfit for military service, while having unusually tight hamstrings wasn't. So the boy who told him we are both special, he was sent off and he was killed. And Cal wasn't allowed to join because he couldn't walk properly because of this deformity, as his father called it. You wouldn't use that term nowadays. Back, and as the author said, I had to put it back into the time period writing about it and try and get the language straight. So the terms were deformed. And so he says, and then he describes the town where he sets his story. And he says that Bonhomie had been founded in a northwest pocket of Ohio in 1857 by a small group of merchants and their families. Anyways, and the town starts to grow. There are immigrants who come from different communities. There's a whole mix of people, and the town slowly grows. By the time America got into the Second World War, the population of the town had topped 6,000. The town had its own police force, fire department, and vocational college. It had 24 restaurants, if you counted coffee shops and soda fountains, 5 banks, 4 dry cleaners, 2 record stores, and a movie house. Industry thrived in and around the town. It wasn't nearly so small that everyone knew everyone else, but it was small enough that sooner or later, most everyone felt as if they had laid eyes on most everyone else. And then he describes that at this point, this was during the Second World War, you would see few soldier-age men in town. And then the incident that starts the story, which is what he wanted to use, happens on the next page. Cal, and we're back to Cal again. Cal's own father had been awarded a Purple Heart for taking a bullet through his shoulder while pulling a wounded officer into a foxhole in France during the war, although the medal was not to be seen in his increasingly cluttered house, and he didn't want to talk about his war days. So his father, Cal's father, wouldn't talk about what happened to him other than it was terrible, and he started to hoard. And then we find out a few pages later that Cal's mother had died of pneumonia after his 3-year-old sister had died of something, and a brother had died of influenza. So there was so much tragedy in this family, but he just presents it to us. So Cal is the only one left, and he says, and I've always had this feeling that of my family, I was the one that my father least would have chosen to remain alive if he would have been able to choose. So he says, Cal was astounded by the impact 2 inches of leg could have on a person. Being deprived of those inches, he'd gained what seemed to be a full and healthy life. So he was living with this guilt that because one leg was 2 inches shorter than the other, he wasn't allowed to join up. In fact, he tries, and in a few pages in, he tries to join, and the doctor says, sorry, son, there's no way we can't use you. But you know what? Sign up for civil, like home service duty. You can walk around and check for air raid sirens, or see if anybody needs you on the home front, which was, on one hand, Cal was relieved secretly because he didn't have to go and fight, but on the other hand, it was a shame that. But he says, and it was a Tuesday morning in early May of 1945, and on that Tuesday morning, Cal had just opened Hanover Hardware on Sutton Street, that's where he's working, and was sitting on a stool behind the counter sorting a box of washers when a woman walked in and asked if he had a radio. Her forehead was high and her red hair was done up in victory rolls. Her mint green dress and matching pillbox hat, her white gloves, and her coral lipstick suggested money to Cal. Her eyes latched onto his as she crossed the linoleum floor. He told her, yes, the store had a Zenith, but it wasn't for sale. It was in the office. She asked where the office was. Basement, Cal said, nodding toward the stairs just past the end of the counter. And without another word, she walked right past him, right past the handwritten sign that read, employees only, and started down the stairs. Ma'am, Cal said. He dropped the washers into the box and followed her. The basement was used mostly for overstock, though there hadn't been much to store in the past few years, with production focused on the war effort. Cal caught up with her as she made her way between two tall sets of half-empty shelves. He indicated the area in the corner that the store's owner, his father-in-law, Roman Hanover, had designated as the office. So Cal is working in his father-in-law's hardware store. It goes on, describes and then he notices, Cal looks at her and realizes she's very beautiful. She has deep jade eyes and she has high cheekbones and she was very beautiful, but she looked agitated and impatient. She motioned toward the radio with one of her gloved hands. Why isn't it on? He switched the radio on, surfed the wheeze and static for whatever she was hoping to hear, and within seconds she found it. Truman informing the country that Germany had surrendered to the Allied forces. So this is the event that he wants to begin his book with. It was the announcement that everyone had been anticipating. Hitler had been dead for a week. The Nazis had surrendered the Netherlands to the British 5 days earlier. Still, the news was breathtaking. Through the window that opened onto the street from their basement, they heard shouts and whistles, car horns tapping. Geez, Cal said, can you imagine what it's like in Berlin right now? I probably would have been there if it weren't for, and he wobbled his shoe with the extra thick sole. But she wasn't interested at his foot. She was looking at the radio. Her eyes were glistening. Do you think, she said? And then she paused as if unsure of what she wanted to ask him. Do you think people will start coming home from Europe? I hope so. But Hirohito's still giving us a run. They might send those guys over to the Pacific. He doesn't know that. And this is Margaret, the wife of Felix, who is in the Pacific on that ship. But we don't know any of this yet. We just know the only name we know now is Cal. And then all of a sudden, this gorgeous redhead walks into his hardware store, asks for the radio, brazenly goes past him down into the basement of the store. And you're thinking, whoa, and asked. And then all of a sudden, as he's trying to figure out what's going on here, she says she pulled him towards her and kissed him. Cal would have gasped if his lips weren't against hers. They kissed until Truman finished speaking. And there's that picture that we always see, not this, but the scene where when victory has just been declared, and it's, I think, New York City, and the sailor, and he's got this woman, and the ticker tape is falling down, and it's the end of the war. So it's kind of a similar picture comes into her, but it's this woman and Cal in the basement of his father-in-law's hardware store. And he doesn't know what hit him. And he heard her sniffle, offered her his handkerchief once they stepped back and she turned off the radio. And she looks around and she says, like, what kind of place is this? There's a tiny desk. There's a brown paper bag with an apple. That was Cal's lunch. And he's a little bit embarrassed. And then she introduces herself. She says, I'm Margaret, by the way, Salt, like the shaker. Her last name is Salt. Well, her married last name is Salt. Cal Jenkins. So now we know the names of the two characters. And then they shake hands and smiled at how formal that felt, given what had just happened between them, this kiss. I should go, said Margaret. And he follows her upstairs. And then she says to him, I've lived in this town for almost 6 years, and I've never been in here once. And Cal nodded, thinking, I would have remembered you, because she's very good looking. And he still can't figure out what went on. And then she turns her at the corner and disappears. And that's the opening scene. And then the book continues, and we get to know the characters. We find out that Cal has recently become a father. He married a local girl, Becky Hanover, whose father-in-law's store he's working. And we find out that Margaret Salt, the foundling, the infant who had been left in a basket on a doorstep in an orphanage at a town, not there in Bonhomie, but in another town, had no family whatsoever, and had gone to Columbus, where she met a very good-looking man by the name, and very lovely and sweet and charming, by the name of Felix Salt, who asked her to marry him, which she had done. And Felix is the one who is in the Navy and who's in the Pacific, and who she was asking, do you think that, are they going to be coming back? Are they going to be coming back from the Pacific too? And those are the four main characters whose lives we are going to be following throughout this story. And so the story goes back and forth, and we find out the backgrounds of the characters. And that's where I said at one point it could almost be, you almost could read it as vignettes in the lives of the characters. And the characters are very interesting. So you have Cal, who's a sweet guy, who has this deformity, as it's called, back when he's talking about it, with this leg 2 inches shorter one than the other, that changes the trajectory of his life had he not had that. He is married to Becky, Rebecca Jenkins, the daughter of, this hardware store owner who's his father-in-law. And Becky is a very wonderful character. And he, the author, her creator, says, I wanted to have a character, and I think she is one of the sweetest, kindest people that I could imagine, but she has a special power, and this is something interesting. She has had a power that she notices since she's a young girl. She can communicate with the spirits in the next world. So that sounds a little hokey or a little magical realism, and the book isn't really a magical realism book. And the author, Patrick Ryan, manages to create this character of Becky, who, when we first meet her, is the way he describes her, she's a little bit quirky, and she was a grade younger than Cal in school, because they meet in a diner one day. And he remembered her as being pretty, very smart, from what he didn't know her, really hardly didn't know her. He remembers seeing her, but a little bit strange. She wore a beret and sometimes a cape. And he remembers an incident being told about her, that someone disappeared from the town, and a neighbor of theirs. And at one point, Becky, who was only 9 years old at the time, was playing with the daughter of the man who disappears. She says, and he doesn't turn up again. He doesn't come by. Police look for him, and they don't know what happened. And apparently the parents had been fighting, so it's thought that maybe he just, he left his family but he just didn't say. And Becky says one day to this man's daughter, your father's not very far away. And I think it's very odd. And it turns out that not long after, they find the car of the father, and it had sunken into the lake he's found. So after that, she realizes that something, and she doesn't know how to describe it, and it's not done in any kind of ostentatious way, but throughout her growing up years, sometimes she has these presentiments, these feelings, but as a child, she doesn't really know. All she knew was that she knew that the father wasn't very far away, and it turns out to be that eventually. And then, so when she's a teenager, she has one good friend, Janice. And she says to Janice, she reads, and she's a voracious reader, very smart. She's always sitting, with her beret and her cape and her books. So she's definitely odd in this small town in in Ohio. and she and her friend Janice have seances. Janice is just a regular girl, but Becky likes to see if they can. I don't know if you remember. I remember somehow when I was a teenager, Ouija boards, and we used to sit there and try and make this like. So they do that, and but eventually Becky, and you can make of it whatever you will throughout the story. She seems, at least the way the author describes her, to have this ability to connect with people who are no longer in this world. And she gets started helping, and she helps people like that. She never takes money for doing this. And she eventually builds up, I guess practice is the wrong word, but people, her reputation grows in the town and people come to see her. Now, if you remember, she is so Cal's born in 1920. She's a year younger than he is. So the Second World War has happened. Many families have lost loved ones, their sons, their brothers, their husbands, fathers, and they want to know what happened to them. They want to connect with them. And people who normally would not be interested in this kind of thing start to come to her because she has a neighbor, a very kind widow, who finds out that Becky does this, and she helps Becky, and it's not, as I said, it's not done in any like ridiculous seeming way. It all seems almost natural. So that's Becky, who's married to Cal. The only problem is, and one of the things that this book looks at, it looks at relationships, it looks at marriage. It begins, and then there is infidelity in the story. This kiss of Cal and Margaret develops into something, but very brief, not like his grandmother's affair of many, many years, the author. Something happens. It's a mistake as they admit later on both their parts, an indiscretion, but they have to live with consequences of that indiscretion in this small town for years after. And that's what links these two couples. But we still get their own individual lives beautifully, I thought, developed in this story. And conflict. So there's all kinds of conflict, which is when people have to live together, there's conflict. So between and two marriages, and remember, the marriages begin in the 1940s or late 1930s in the case of Felix and Margaret. And times were different then, and what was accepted by society then, or what was not accepted, might be today. Things have changed. But in the case of Cal and his wife Becky, Cal he doesn't believe that she has, like, what kind of nonsense are your powers communing with dead people? He thinks it's ridiculous. And she's insulted and offended, but she doesn't stop doing it. Her concession to him at one point, because she used to take the people who would come to see her upstairs. There's a little room upstairs, and she would take them there. Like, she draws the curtains, they sit at a table, and she tries to hear if she can make contact with the person that the person who comes to see her has requested. And at one point, when something happens and some unscrupulous character tries to lure Becky away, her husband and her father says to her husband, "You know what? Marriage is not easy, and you got to figure out how to make things work. But you know what? Just have her see the people who come in your living room, or downstairs in your side room, so that not far from your front door, so you're not worried about, hanky panky going on. And just let her do it. Humor her with her little thing that she thinks she could talk to the spirit world. But that drives a wedge in their relationship. They otherwise have a very good marriage. They have a child. She's not able to have more. They have this boy Skip, and the years go on. They have their ups, they have their downs, and as the years go, they separate for a while, they get back together. Margaret and Felix, meanwhile, the other couple who are linked to them, they also have things to deal with. Felix is a tormented man. He's a tormented man for various reasons, but also a kind, good man. Margaret, of all the characters, she's the baby this beautiful woman, this strikingly beautiful woman, who was left as an an orphan who never knew a family, who's always grown up with this feeling of being abandoned by a mother, doesn't know how to mother, doesn't really want to mother. She has one son. And where does the book get its title? The book is called Buckeye. So I didn't know, naive that I am, that, do you know what Buckeye is? Hmm? It's a tree, right? Did you say a tree? Yeah, it's original. Yeah, right. So it's a tree. It's used as a tree. So there's a Buckeye tree. It's planted there in the yard when they buy this house. So I looked up Buckeye because they didn't want to. So first up on my Google search come these candies. If you want to make confections, so they're called Buckeyes, and they are peanut butter on the inside, enrobed by chocolate, but you don't cover the whole thing. You leave a little bit. So it looks like a buck eye, like a buck is in a deer, a buck eye, like, this like round eyeball with. So, but anyway, the buckeye is a tree. Interesting about the tree. So I looked it up. It's the Ohio state tree. So very much fits. It's a member of the horse chestnut family, which makes sense when you look at the pictures of it. You know what chestnuts look like. In the spring, a very beautiful pale yellowish green foliage, and it turns into fruit by late summer, also like this yellowish green fruit that's very tough looking. And by the fall, the fruit develop husks, these very tough husks, and they fall to the ground. And the husks come off, and the special nut inside is called the Buckeye. Very, very poisonous, highly poisonous. In fact, apparently the Native Americans knew how poisonous the nut was, and they would grind the nut into powder, and the powder they would use when they wanted to trap fish or when they wanted to catch certain things. The only animal, for some reason, apparently nobody knows why, squirrels can eat small quantities of these Buckeyes and not get poisoned. But if a human eats it, they get very, very sick. So that's what the Buckeye is, but they're the Ohio state tree. And it also becomes the name of one of the characters. Skip, who is the son of Cal and Becky, he nicknames Tom, who is 2 years younger than he is, and the boys' lives become connected. They don't know how connected they are, but they're connected. They become friendly at some points. And they play and they climb this Buckeye tree. They climb a Buckeye tree and they collect these nuts and they start throwing them or shooting them up. And Skip nicknames Tom Buckeye. So those are the references to what Buckeye is, and that's where he gets the title of his book. So really, to sum up, because maybe I don't know if anybody has any questions. You could say, as besides the elevator pitch that Patrick Ryan gave the book, that this is, as one reviewer commented, a small town novel of epic proportions, memorable characters, thorny human dilemmas about a vanished America from the 1920s to the early 1980s, I would say. It's insightful. The prose, I thought, was beautifully done, lyrical. Its themes? Its themes are life, and in this case as well, about world wars that affect countries. America, the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War. These were pivotal years in the development of the history of America. The mysteries of interpersonal relationships between men and women, and family life, love, secrets, and forgiveness, like big, big themes. And interestingly, he made a comment. He said, I wanted to set my book in a time I didn't bring it up to modern day. Because how far to go on? He starts it in 1920. He has Cal being born in 1920, because then Cal's father could be a veteran of the First World War, because that works. Then the Second World War, Cal is the one that he couldn't become part of because of his deformity. And then there's Vietnam, which the sons with the boys are affected by. So that's how he sets it. He doesn't continue. I guess he could have continued if he wanted it to go on. But he said, and I thought this was interesting, he said, I didn't want to set it in a time where I'd have to deal with technology. I wanted it, isn't that an interesting thought? I wanted it to be a time before texting and before all this technology was so prevalent because I didn't want to have to deal with it. And that throws, if you think of it, a different light on things because they had telephones and cars in the 1940s when like the beginning part of the book, the main part of the book went on. The end of the book, it's as if, so there were interesting comments I found about what he chose, the how many years he chose to include. The I thought the best part of the book are those years in the 1940s and the 1950s. Beautiful, to me, very interesting descriptions of how post-war America, post-World War II America boomed. In the 1950s, America was booming. And he has these descriptions about how Bonamy grows and how, what used to be the outskirts of the city are no longer the outskirts of the city. And it's thriving and how strip malls first come and just the beginning of the first of this and the first of that. Cal, who's working in his father-in-law's hardware store sorting washers when we first meet him, when Margaret Salt walks in and plants that kiss on his face and, that they become acquainted. Then eventually he starts to sell appliances. When appliances become more a part of American life, washing machines, refrigerators, and eventually televisions. And he tells his father-in-law, who also owns two businesses in neighboring towns, which, by the way, apparently are real towns. The father-in-law has a lamp store in one place and a diner in another town. But he says to his father-in-law, appliances. We have to stock appliances. And his father-in-law is like, no, we could just do hardware. And Cal prevails and reorganizes the store. And it's full of, so if you need to buy a washing machine, a dryer, like these, imagine, this is back in the 1950s, it wasn't so common, 1940s. Television. Like there's a big 1945 when when peace was declared, it was the radio people were watching. There was no television yet. Television started to come into play in the 1950s. So he becomes very successful, Cal, and the little hardware store does very well, and he becomes a successful businessman. So it's a wonderful story and it follows the last few years. I guess I didn't find quite as interesting, but I really liked and somebody, one of the reviewers said, I wish it would have gone on for another 200 pages. I was sad when it finished. It felt I wanted to spend more time with these characters. So 450 pages, it's a very easy read, let me say that, for those of you who haven't read it. Okay, so it's past 2:00. Anybody questions? Yes, yes. So again, I just don't know how much to write. Yeah. So he's a man who is conflicted, like he knows, and it's the time where and Patrick Ryan said he remembers speaking to people. And Patrick Ryan, by the way, is a gay man. How do I know? Well, just because I read that he lives with it. So I thought that's interesting. That's why he can write about that part of the book, and explore the sexuality of homosexual relationships very authentically. But it's that this conflicted man, and you think if Felix would be living in 2026, wouldn't be such a problem. But back in 1930 something, he was expected to get married. He knew that something was wrong. It affected not only him because he was tortured because of this, because he tried so hard, but Margaret, this gorgeous woman who of all the characters, she had no compunction about sleeping with men when she moved from the orphanage to the big, when she realized how her beauty could attract men and possibly serve her well or not serve her well. But she loved Felix, and they loved and cared for each other, but there was this terrible problem which they had to deal with. And their son, and the issue of the son, well, okay, that I'm not yeah. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. I don't know what qualifies. I mean, you could say technically anything that happened past before today, you could call. I don't know, but is it? Yeah. How many years would you say? secondary to the place or the era. Uh-huh. But you're talking about no, but I'm talking about in a novel. Like what were you more asking? But were you more asking at what point, how far back in the past is considered historical fiction? Not. He said when he started to write it, he didn't think it was, but then when he realized that he had to do research, and if he was researching for the First World War and the Second World War, that by now is historical fiction. Yes. So Everett, right? So Everett and many reviewers like that's Cal's father, who is the shell, like you say, shell shock, but the veteran of the horrors of the First World War, as well as his personal tragedies. He loses his wife and two children, without the having lived through the trenches in France, like losing these, and it also what struck me was this how we live in 2026 and we have antibiotics and we have surgery and we think modern medicine can help us do all kinds of things, but in the 20s and in the 30s and in the 40s it didn't, and people died, like you people died of polio, people died of tuberculosis. I mean the Everett's wife Dora dies, Cal's mother dies of TB. These were very, very real. And so when Becky starts her, when she realizes that, maybe she has this special ability to connect, there are so many people who want to speak to their loved ones and people who lost children and um so which still exists today. But yeah. So that's an interesting point, right? Because with texting and with like it's harder, and it things are hard. Is it harder? Yes. So, but he said he didn't want to deal with it, and it reminded me. Who else did we do recently? Who said Ann Tyler, I think, also said she doesn't, and she writes very contemporary, but she has a little once in a while, like in the last book we did, the 3 days in June about the wedding, and the like. She'll say he texted him or something, so there is reference, but it's a whole other. World, and he specifically said, I thought that was so interesting, I didn't want to put any technology into my story. Anyway, yes. Okay, so that's it. So as he said, plot wasn't so much the focus. The focus was the characters. And and well, the story, yeah, no. I mean, the story is the lives of these four people as the years progress. Like there's no, there is an affair. The two of they have an affair. One, the woman from Margaret with Cal, brief, um, and Margaret realizes not good, gonna end it. And but it's the repercussions, it's what goes on in the ensuing years and how their lives develop, how their relationships, do their marriages last, what happens to it's very much character based. And he says that. He said, I plot is not for me, like I don't, it's not important for me, but it describes years of people's lives. If I want to say that's the plot, you have to read it. Yeah. Buckeye? Yeah. Oh, well, I didn't know either. That's why I said so. It's a kind of tree, and it's the Ohio national state tree. And it has this fruit. I was thinking, do we get really symbolic that the fruit is poisonous? I don't know. But I don't think so. But it's Buckeye on it's set in Ohio. Yes. Oh, I'm glad you did. So we could have, if it was a book discussion club and everybody read it, we could do it very differently. That's, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, you're right, right. And yeah, 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 yeah. And but how they all their lives are so interwoven. Every if you need to go, go. I'm gonna stay a little bit. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. A period piece, right? A period of 40 years. A period piece. Okay. So say 40 years. And I would and interesting like what American writers influenced him. And I'm thinking maybe we should do The Grapes of Wrath. Like that was one of like, because I like doing older, I haven't read it in many years, but yeah,